Dominguez, and today I will be talking about the Korean War. This war happened in the early 1950s and was one of the first big conflicts during the Cold War. Even though it's sometimes called the Forgotten War, it still played a big role in shaping how the world looks today, especially in Asia. In this presentation, I'll be explaining how the war started, who was involved, what the fighting looked like, and how it even ended. I'll also talk about why it still matters today. Let's start with what led to the war. After World War II ended in 1945, Korea, which had been controlled by Japan, was then split in half. The north part was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the southern part was then controlled by the United States. They decided in order to divide Korea, it should be divided in the 30th parallel, which is the line that runs across the middle of the country. In the north, a communist government was set up under Kim Il-sung, and in the south, a democratic government was formed under Syngman Rhee. Both sides wanted to control all of Korea, and tensions kept growing. Then, on June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Their army was well prepared and had strong Soviet weapons. They moved quickly and captured the capital, Seoul, in just a couple of days. The South Korean army wasn't ready for such a big threat or attack. The US and other countries in the United Nations quickly responded to this threat. President Harry Truman believed in something called containment, which means stopping the spread of communism. He didn't want North Korea to take over the whole country and spread communism. The US led the United Nations troops, and General Douglas MacArthur was then put in charge. Things looked really bad at first for South Korean troops. North Korea had pushed South Korean and UN troops all the way back to the southeast corner of the country near the city of Pusan. This area became known as the Pusan Perimeter. It was one of the last places still under South Korean control. But General MacArthur came up with a smart plan. In September 1950, he had led a surprise attack at Incheon, a port city near Seoul. This was a risky move because of the tides and rocky shores, but it still worked. The landing helped United Nations forces cut off North Korean troops and take back Seoul. After that, the UN forces pushed the North Korean army all the way back past the 38th parallel and close to China's border, near the Yalu River. At that point, some leaders warned that China might want to start getting involved, but those warnings weren't taken seriously. In October and November of 1950, China would send out hundreds of thousands of troops into North Korea in order to help fight against the United Nations forces. These Chinese soldiers launched surprise attacks in the mountains and forced the United Nations troops to retreat. The weather was freezing cold, and many soldiers suffered from frostbite and even other injuries. One of these major battles was the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. U.S. Marines were surrounded by Chinese troops but managed to fight their way out. Even though it was a retreat, the Marines considered it a heroic escape. It showed how tough the war had become. By early 1951, both of the sides were stuck. The war turned into a stalemate, meaning there was a constant fighting, but no side was winning. The front lines didn't move much, and the war became more about holding ground than gaining it. The Korean War wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in towns, villages, and inside the hearts of ordinary people. From 1950 to 1953, Korean civilians found themselves caught in a brutal conflict that tore their country into two. The war caused unimaginable destruction. Cities like Seoul, Pyongyang, and countless others were bombed repeatedly. The U.S. dropped more bombs on Korea than it had in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Napalm scorched entire landscapes, and the once thriving countryside was left in ruins. Families fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. People walked for miles. Elderly parents carrying grandchildren, children separated from their mothers in the chaos, desperate crowds crossing icy rivers and climbing mountains. refugee camps became overcrowded, food was scarce, and disease was very common. Millions became homeless overnight. In the north, civilians faced a regime that demanded total loyalty, while in the south, the threat of invasion kept people in constant fear. The trauma of being bombed, losing loved ones, or even witnessing violence left deep scars in many of which remain today. Soldiers on both sides also face unbearable hardship. Over 5 million troops from 21 countries fought in Korea. American soldiers, many barely out of high school, found themselves in bitterly cold trenches, frostbitten and exhausted, facing a determined enemy in unfamiliar terrain. The cold was so severe that weapons jammed and skin froze to the metal. Medical care was basic. Helicopters were used for the first time in order to transport the wounded, but for many, help came way too late. The fighting was grueling. Hills were taken and lost again and again. The psychological toll was enormous. Thousands came home with what we know as PTSD, but at the time there was little understanding or support. On the home front in the US, families waited anxiously for letters, often the only connection they had to their loved ones. The media provided limited coverage, and many Americans couldn't even locate Korea on a map. This added to a feeling of confusion and detachment that made the Korean War, also known as the Forgotten War. Meanwhile, political tensions reached a boiling point when President Truman dismissed General Douglas MacArthur in 1951 for insubordination. After MacArthur pushed for expanding the war into China, it sparked outrage. Many Americans saw MacArthur as a hero, but Truman's decision reflected the need to contain the war, not expand it into a clear conflict. This moment reminded the nation that civilian control of the military is a foundational principle of American democracy. By the middle of 1951, both of the sides had lost many soldiers, and neither side was winning. The war had turned into a bloody standstill. Peace talks started in a village called Panmunjom, but even while the two sides were talking, the fighting still continued. A big disagreement during the talks was about what to do with prisoners of war. Many North Korean and Chinese soldiers captured by the United Nations did not want to go back to their countries because they were afraid of being punished or even killed. The United Nations wanted each prisoner to choose whether to return home or not, but North Korea and China wanted all their soldiers to be sent back home. This argument dragged the talks out for over a year. While leaders argued, soldiers kept dying. Some of the worst battles happened over the hills like Pork Chop Hill and Old Baldy. Thousands of lives were lost, even though the land being fought over was not very important. It became clear that leaders, all they cared about more was about gaining political power than actually winning the war. Finally, on July 27, 1953, both of the sides agreed to stop fighting. This was not a peace treaty, just a ceasefire. The Korean peninsula stayed at a standstill around the 38th parallel, and a new buffer zone was created between North and South Korea. This area is called the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. It is 2.5 miles wide and 160 miles long. It is filled with soldiers, landmines, and even security cameras, and is still one of the most heavily guarded borders around the world. Even though there is no fighting today, the two countries are still technically at war. The armistice stopped the battles, but it did not bring true peace. The Korean War changed a lot. For Korea, it left behind a divided nation, a shattered landscape of war, some would say, and a generation that is traumatized by war. Over 5 million people died, more than half were civilians. Many families were torn apart, siblings were separated, and many children were left without parents. After the war, South Korea had to rebuild from almost nothing. For a long time, it was very poor and unstable. But with the help from other countries, strong education, growing industries, and hard work, South Korea became one of the richest and most successful countries in the world today. Today, it is a modern democracy known for its technology, music, movies, and culture. North Korea went in a very different direction. Its leader, Kim Il sung, created a strict dictatorship that relied on propaganda, fear, and military power. His son and grandson kept ruling the same way. North Korea became one of the most closed and tightly controlled countries in the world. The government focused on building weapons, especially nuclear bombs, rather than helping its people. Food shortages and strict rules are still part of the daily life there. The war also had a big impact on the United States. It was the first major fight of the Cold War and the first time U.S. troops fought as part of the United Nations. It tested America's goal of stopping the spread of communism and led to future involvement in places like Vietnam. The war also changed American foreign policy. It showed that the U.S. was willing to use its military to defend its friends. Even today, about 28,500 American soldiers are still in South Korea in order to help protect it from threats from the North. The Korean War also helped change the military. It was one of the first wars where black and white soldiers truly served together as one. After President Truman ordered the military to integrate in 1948. This was a big step toward racial equality in armed forces. Many Korean War veterans came home to little recognition. Unlike World War II veterans, they did not get parades or much attention. In recent years, people have worked to honor their service and teach others about what they went through. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, but it was one of the most important events of the 1900s. It was the first big fight during the Cold War, the first time the United Nations sent soldiers to stop a war, and the first time the U.S. military fought a war without a clear, decisive winner. It reminds us that not all wars have winners, and that peace does not always come just because the fighting ends. The Korean War is also a story about the people, about families torn apart, young soldiers sent to fight, and a country split by different belief systems. It shows us how easily peace can be lost and how much people suffer because of war. Even today, the effects of the war are still seen. North and South Korea are still divided. North Korea's nuclear weapons are still a danger to the world. And the DMZ is a strong reminder of a war that never officially ended. But there are signs of hope too. Some families separated by the war have been allowed short reunions. Young people in South Korea still honor the soldiers who fought. And many Korean War veterans now share these stories to help others understand what they went through. Learning about the Korean War teaches us about strength, sacrifice, and the need for peaceful solutions. It helps us think about questions like, what does it mean to fight for freedom? What would we give up for peace? And how can we stop the same mistakes from happening again and again?